Hi and welcome back to a new video. Finally, it's RTX 5090 launch time. I spent pretty much the entire past 5 days benchmarking this card, going through all my results, analyzing benchmarks, getting everything together, and today is the time to discuss all those results because they're quite interesting. Obviously, this is the fastest graphics card that you can buy for gaming. But there are also things we have to discuss, such as power consumption, coil whine, and also performance in some specific scenarios. So that will be the topic for today's video. Thermal Grizzly Duronaut is our new high-end thermal paste and the successor of Cryonaut. It's even better performing, it is much easier to apply, it is cheaper, and it's much more durable. That's where the name comes from. Especially if you're now maybe considering to buy a new PC, then I would highly recommend that you're looking into this thermal paste. So let's continue with this video. At this point, I'm pretty sure you know everything about the specs regarding the RTX 5090, so we will not talk about this again, but you might also remember the detail from the previous video where we were estimating an additional performance gain over the RTX 4090 by plus 27% according to an Nvidia slide and also the leaks. Now tested, if we switch into the 3D Mark x by Extreme GT1, it's only plus 26%. So we were pretty close, at least compared to the RTX 4090. But I also have to point out that this is a pretty old test, the x by Extreme GT1. I just use it because I have a lot of comparison data, for example, also a GTX 1080 Ti. And in this comparison, we can see that the 1080 Ti is about 5 times slower, or the 5090 is about 5 times faster. So at this point, somebody might already think about upgrading to a 5090. But to make this decision easier for you, I included all those previous generations in most of the benchmarks. So for example, if you have an RTX 2080 Ti and you're considering to upgrade, I included this, or for example, a 3090, that you can always see the generational improvement compared to the 5090. But in all the charts, when I'm talking about it, we will only compare it directly with the 4090. So we're switching to a more recent benchmark, again 3D Mark, but this time the Speedway. And as usual in my charts, you can not only see the performance in yellow, but always also the power consumption in blue. And if we're looking at the RTX 4090, you can see a power consumption of 408 watts, and it is delivering a performance of 101 FPS. If we're now looking to the RTX 5090, it is 44% faster, but also consumes 551 watts under load. This example shows that there are scenarios where an RTX 5090 can even beat an RTX 4090 in terms of efficiency, which in the first moment seems to be impossible looking at a power draw of 550 watts under load, and also considering the TDP of 575. But compared to the 4090 in Speedway, we saw an increase of 44% in performance and 35% in power draw. But going back to all this power draw, it obviously has a huge impact on the cooling and the temperatures. And especially we talked so much about the Founders Edition in the past, we might want to look at how this is performing. Just as additional information for what you will see in a second, I have a room temperature of about 21 degrees Celsius in here. And here you can see the running GeForce RTX 5090 Founders Edition. Also nice GeForce RTX logo on top in white. And also we see this X or cross in the center of the card that might look a little bit better once this is sitting in a darker environment or even like a darker system. I also want to point out again that this card is in an open test bench, was always tested in an open condition, so it has very easy access to cold air, like in here 21 degrees Celsius. That might definitely change or be much worse once you put it in a closed system, and it might intake a little bit warmer air than what it has here right now. Currently the fans are spinning between 1600 and 1700 RPM, which was in an acceptable, I would say, noise range, but again, this might change once you put it in a closed system. This is SW Outlaws. I have been running for about 10 minutes right now. You can also see some nice artifacts on the left, some bugs, which is something I also had with the 4090, so it's not related to the 5090, but I had some issues with this game in general, but we will come back to this later. And on the second monitor, we can see the information covered with hardware info. First of all, GPU temperature, it is somewhere between 73 and 75 degrees Celsius, peaked out at 78. Compared to my 4090 Founders Edition, this is roughly 10 degrees Celsius higher. Then we have GPU memory junction temperature, which is constantly at 88 degrees Celsius. And what you might notice is GPU hotspot temperature is reading 255. Well, I asked Nvidia, you can't read this anymore on the RTX 5090, but we will get back to that topic later. What I want to point out is that even in a gaming scenario, it is absolutely possible, as you can see, that the card is constantly pulling about 550 watts. What we can also see is that the GPU clock is changing between 2600 and 2700 megahertz. I then reached out to Nvidia to figure out why we can't read the hotspot anymore, and they told me that they made some changes with Blackwell and that you can now read out the memory temperature for the first time. And they also claimed that for GeForce GPUs, the hotspot temperature has never been a relevant metric, and that only the normal temperature and the boost clocking combination matter. To be honest, this kind of confused me because we all know that the memory temperature was already there on an RTX 30 and 40 GPU, so that didn't make any kind of sense. Then I asked again, and then they claimed that they changed the API and that this metric is no longer accurate and no longer relevant, whatever this means. Then again, I have to point out that especially on GPUs with this size, the GB202, it is a massive GPU. And what you're getting displayed in, let's say, GPUC or hardware info is like an average value of what is predicted to be the correct temperature of your GPU. But depending on your workload, you have some spots that are hotter and some spots that are colder. And that might also lead to, for example, after a certain amount of time, or even if you switch to, let's say, a water block and you change the thermal paste application, that the temperature on average is correct or is fine, but there might be a spot you missed or something that is wrong with the thermal paste application out of the factory. And it's just a very useful metric for the user to check this and to track down if there are any problems. So it doesn't make sense that it's gone. To claim that this metric is not used internally also doesn't really make a lot of sense, considering that the hottest spot on your GPU is definitely relevant and is definitely a metric they will be using. They will certainly not ignore the hottest sensor reading on their chip. It just doesn't make any kind of sense. That's definitely relevant for especially like stuff like boost clocks. So yeah, I'm not sure why they decided to do so. If we take a look at the temperature that we just saw in our scenario, we in Star Wars just saw about 78 degrees Celsius peak and between 74 and 76 degrees Celsius under load. If I compare it with my 4090, there I had a difference between GPU temperature and hotspot of about 10 degrees Celsius. If we compare this back to the 5090, it would mean that we would probably see hotspot temperatures on this card maybe of 85 to maybe 90 degrees Celsius. And maybe those hotspot temperatures were too high for Nvidia's liking. At least that's just some speculation. Or yeah, please Nvidia tell me what's the real reason to not display the hottest temperature. Now with the memory temperature, we also saw 88 degrees Celsius under load, which is also again higher than what we saw on an RTX 4090. And all of this together, we see about 10 to maybe 15 degrees Celsius higher temperatures on the 5090 Founders Edition versus the 4090. And that is also something we speculated about before release, that the fact that they made it smaller is not only a result of the enhanced cooler, but also of a higher temperature target. I mean, setting the GPU and memory higher by more than 10 degrees Celsius certainly also allows to scale the cooler down a little bit. I also tested PCI Express speed and also power target stuff, but this was too much for this video, so they will be coming in videos after today. Now getting to benchmarks, I also tested UL Procyon, which is an AI image generation benchmark based on Stable Diffusion. I prepared all the comparison data with, let's say, the 3080 Ti or 4090, but unfortunately it wouldn't run on the 5090, at least at the point of testing, and it was always giving me a workload error. But I also want to point out that this is not Nvidia's fault. It seemed that the benchmark was just not ready yet, not yet compatible with the 5090. We are starting into the gaming benchmarks with Cyberpunk in 4K without ray tracing and without path tracing. That will come later in a dedicated DLSS segment of this video. Without these features, Cyberpunk is definitely playable even without DLSS, and we can see about 105 FPS on average and 72 in the 1% low. That is a gain of 46% over the 4090, and with 518 watts under load, this was an increase in power consumption over the 4090 of 37%. So again, also in this scenario, in a gaming scenario, the 5090 can be more efficient than the 4090, even though it is pulling more than 500 watts. But that is simply because the proportional performance increase is just higher than the power consumption increase. In Remnant 2 4K Ultra, the RTX 5090 is giving us a performance increase of 29%. However, in this scenario, at least percentage-wise, the power consumption increase is higher. This means that the RTX 4090 would be more efficient. However, the RTX 5090 the first time delivers native rendering quality in 4K and max details to be able to play this game like fully smooth, without relying on DLSS. Assassin's Creed Mirage in 4K and ultra settings shows that RTX 5090 doesn't necessarily have to pull above 500 watt in every scenario. And with 143 FPS on average and 101 in the 1% low, it is also super smooth to play, again without DLSS. However, if we compare it again with the 4090, it is only a performance increase of plus 18%. My benchmark selection might sometimes be a little bit weird or unconventional, but this is definitely intended, especially for the sake of giving you a broader field of results. And especially when we're looking at launch events and tests like this, it's just very important that you look at multiple reviews to get a good impression of the product, because I can also just do mistakes, and I also want to deliver different test results than what other people might be doing. And talking about this, high FPS shooters like CS2 and Valorant might not be ideal to load a high-end product like this. It's usually better to test CPUs, but I think it also belongs in here to get the bigger picture. In Counter-Strike 2, we can definitely still see some scaling. We see 600 FPS on average, 373 in the 1% low. Again, as all other games today in the test, it is 4K resolution and max details. And we can see a 24% gain over the RTX 4090, while the 5090 is pulling 430 watts on average. For example, I'm still playing PUBG. Here we can see a little bit worse scaling. It's plus 16% over the 4090 when it comes to performance, but plus 29 in power consumption. That means the card is also pulling above 500 watts under load. The higher we go in FPS, the worse the scaling becomes. At least that's the impression I have. If we're looking here, for example, at Valorant with 1200 FPS on average in my performance scenario. And I'm pretty sure that in this condition, the card is also a little bit CPU bottlenecked. That definitely contributes to the lower performance scaling. But what we can see scaling is the power consumption, plus 47% over the 4090. For example, also if you're looking at an RTX 3090, the 5090 is twice as fast. I'm trying to rush a little bit through the benchmarks, but you can obviously always pause if you're interested in looking into some details. We will now already go over to DLSS, but not DLSS 4 yet. We are first looking at Assassin's Creed Mirage, and all the cards in here were tested with DLSS in the quality setting. Only the second row is the RTX 5090 with the native setting, and of course the 7900 XTX is tested with FSR2, again in quality. If we compare the 5090 with DLSS to native rendering, then switching on DLSS helps to increase the performance by 20%, while it helps to decrease the power consumption by 11%. Comparing the RTX 4090 with DLSS enabled and also the 5090 with DLSS enabled, we can see a performance increase of 15%, but also a power consumption increase of 27%. An RTX 4090 with DLSS quality is about as fast as an RTX 5090 natively rendered in Assassin's Creed Mirage. In Remnant 2, again, both cards with DLSS, I could only observe a small performance increase of 6%, but power increase of 35%, which seemed odd. But it might also be odd that a 7900 XTX with FSR3 is beating a 5090, so that might be just missing or bad optimization of the game. Both Remnant 2 and Assassin's Creed Mirage cannot use DLSS 4 yet. I'm not sure if it's coming, but I just wanted to include this because not every game might be updated to DLSS 4. And talking about DLSS 4, I wanted to start testing SW Outlaws, which looked promising in the Nvidia demo, but then it just, wouldn't really work. I had some issues. Firstly, I had a lot of artifacts in this game, which I'm not sure where it's coming from. For example, here in this scenario, you can see some weird artifacts on the floor. And then switching over to this well, you can see some plants in it. And depending on how I'm walking, they're just warping in and out. So some stuff was not right. But the biggest problem I had was enabling multi-frame generation, which just didn't work. So I went to the settings and I tried to enable it. And whenever I clicked on apply, the game just closed. And whenever I opened it again, it was not enabled. We will still look at a performance comparison, and here you can see a side-by-side comparison of DLSS without frame generation. On the left, you can see the native rendering. It was giving about 90 FPS. DLSS quality in the center, about 100 FPS. DLSS performance on the right with about 140 FPS. But honestly, I couldn't really tell a difference of the image quality just playing it. And here we can see the performance measured in the scene. The 5090 is about 27% faster than the 4090, while it pulls 539 watts. DLSS quality is increasing the performance by 15% and DLSS performance by 53%, and even without frame generation. I then decided to switch to Cyberpunk, which also had this press preview of DLSS 4, because currently it didn't seem natively supported, but at least in Cyberpunk it was working fine. And also a reminder, in all of the games, also Cyberpunk, I'm using an in-game scene and not the built-in benchmark. Without enabling DLSS in this scene, with 4K, ray tracing and path tracing enabled, the 5090 is 32% faster than the 4090, but both, I mean, one is 33 FPS, the other one is 25 FPS, it's absolutely unplayable. Only enabling DLSS quality and multi-frame generation will make this playable. DLSS quality in combination with multi-frame generation enables the 5090 to be 135% faster than a 4090, which was also running DLSS quality. Now if we switch to DLSS performance, it is even faster, 286 FPS on average. That is 125% faster than the 4090 with DLSS performance. Those numbers roughly align with what Nvidia was advertising, and I also want to point out, and regarding this entire fake frames discussion, it is important to have everything in a review. Both native rendering and DLSS. You know, Nvidia, they would only like to see DLSS 4 benchmarks and neglect everything else. But then there are also people that only accept native rendering, but I think the truth is somewhere in between. You need both, and it depends on the scenario. For example, here with 4K ray tracing and path tracing, it's just not playable without the DLSS and multi-frame generation. That is just a fact. And then I also read comments of people saying that whenever they enable DLSS, they can't feel a performance increase even though the number is higher. And that is something that we have to discuss or talk about. For example, here in Cyberpunk, I was seeing 286 FPS on average, but it didn't really feel like 286 FPS. The reason for this might be the 1% lows. At least in my scenario, you can see that the average FPS drastically increased, especially from native rendering to DLSS quality. It's about 6 times as much on the average FPS, but it didn't even double in the 1% low. We see an increase from 28 to 46 FPS, which is a lot, but it's still not as much. This might be an explanation why a lot of people are saying that what they're feeling subjectively doesn't align with the numbers they can see objectively in terms of average FPS. Still, DLSS can be a very useful technology to improve your gameplay or just make some scenes even playable at all. And now, before we get to the conclusion, I want to talk a little bit about the Coil whine of my RTX 5090, which seemed a bit worse than my 4090 Founders Edition. It's not as bad as what we had with the 4096 from Asus back then at launch, but we should definitely talk about it. We are looking at 3D Mark Speedway because with about 150 FPS, that's pretty much what you want to have in a gaming scenario. Time to talk about the conclusion of the 5090, or how I like to call it, the 4090 Ti. Averaged over the 9 tests that I did, I saw a performance increase of 26%, while the power consumption increased by 35%. At the same time, we have a price increase, roughly, if it's available, at MSRP of about 25%. All of this together kind of aligns, and it sounds like, you know, a 4090 on steroids. More power increase, more price, all roughly in the same relation, which sounds okay to me. To be honest, I'm not disappointed, because previously we saw that people might be disappointed, and that might just be the case because the performance increase from 3090 to 4090 was so huge. The problem here is that it's still the same manufacturing node that TSMC used for the 4090. It's maybe a little bit improved, but it's not a big step. And that's why we also didn't see such a big step with the 5090. So to me, this is more like a neutral conclusion. It's just more performance, more price, all in the same relation. It's just not impressive. With DLSS 4, the 5090 is definitely also coming with very interesting features, and I can understand that people are criticizing how Nvidia made the launch with this heavily focused AI and DLSS benchmarking, but I also think it is an important feature that allows to make some of the unplayable games playable, such as Cyberpunk with ray tracing and path tracing, but I also think that Nvidia should focus in both directions and also go back and show more of the native rendering. At least that's the impression I have, that people would like to see more of both worlds. With the power consumption of 450 to 550 watts under load in the gaming scenario, that is also something you have to consider, depending where you live, both for your energy bill and also if you're, for example, living in an area without AC. In summer, you will definitely feel the 500 watts. The RTX 5090 in the Founders Edition can handle those 550 watts quite well, but it's also a result of Nvidia increasing the temperature target of about 10 degrees Celsius roughly, also using liquid metal, and that all combined kind of explains how it was possible to also shrink down the cooler so much versus the 4090. And at this point, I'm still not happy about that we can't read out the hotspot temperature, but maybe Nvidia, you can still change your mind about that. To end this video, I quickly want to address the RTX 5090 launch in general, because I'm not quite happy about how Nvidia handled this launch in terms of the timeline. This card arrived on Friday. And from this time, now it's Wednesday evening, I didn't do anything else than, get up in the morning, test this card, evaluate data, building charts, writing the script and everything to shoot this video on Wednesday evening. And it still has to be cut to be online Thursday afternoon. But like 6 days between getting a card and the launch, and you have to, do everything from testing. It just doesn't allow any room for mistakes. There might be mistakes, or for example, I couldn't debug anything with SW Outlaws or UL Procyon. You just can't do anything. That was not nice. And luckily, I don't really have a life, so fine. I could test at the weekend, but if you're a normal tester and you might have the family to look for at the weekend, then good luck doing something like this in such a time frame. Right. RTX 5090 in general, interesting, and I would like to see availability and pricing. That should be interesting. Thanks for tuning in. And tomorrow should be a video about power target testing, and then the day after about PCI Express speed of the 5090. See you next time. Bye-bye.